Chapter 15 The Man of the Island. From the side of the hill, which was steep and stony, a spout of gravel was dislodged and fell rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a pine. What it was, whether bear or man or monkey, I could not tell. It seemed dark and shaggy, more I knew not, but the terror of this new apparition brought me to a standstill. I was now, it seemed, cut off on both sides. Behind me, the murderers; before me, this lurking nondescript. And immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with this creature of the woods, and I turned on my heel, and looking sharply behind over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boats. Instantly the figure reappeared, and making a wide circuit began to head me off. I was tired, at any rate, but had I been as fresh as when I came, I could see it was in vain for me to contend in speed with such an adversary. From trunk to trunk this creature flitted like a deer, running manlike on two legs, but unlike any man that I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran. Yet man it was, I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I had heard of cannibals. I was within an ace of calling for help, but the mere fact that he was a man, however wild, had somehow reassured me, and my fear of Silver began to revive in proportion. I stood still, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape, and as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed into my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island, and I walked briskly towards him. He was concealed by this time behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction, he reappeared and took a step to meet me. Then he hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself on his knees and held out his clasped hands in supplication. At that I stopped. "Who are you?" I asked. "Ben Gunn," he answered, and his voice sounded hoarse and awkward like a rusty lock. "I'm poor Ben Gunn, I am. I haven't spoke with a Christian these 3 years." I could see now that he was a pleasant-looking man, his skin burnt by the sun. His fair eyes looked startling in his sunburnt face. Of all the beggar men I had seen or fancied, he was the chief for raggedness. He was clothed with tatters of old ship's canvas and old sea cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gascon. About his waist he wore an old brass-buckled leather belt, which was the one thing solid in his whole outfit. 3 years, I cried. "Were you shipwrecked?" "Nay, mate," he said, "marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment common enough among the buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and shot, and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years agone," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries and oysters. Wherever a man is, says I, a man can do for himself. But, mate, my heart is sore for the Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now? No? Well, many's the long night I dreamed of cheese, toasted mostly, and woke up again, and here I were. If ever I can get aboard again, I said, you shall have cheese by the stone. All this time he had been feeling the stuff of my jacket, smoothing my hands, looking at my boots, and generally, in the intervals of his speech, showing a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. But at my last words he perked up into a kind of startled slyness. If ever you can get aboard again, says you. Why now, who's to hinder you? Not you, I know, was my reply. And right you was, he cried. Now what do you call yourself, mate? Jim, I told him. Jim, says he, quite pleased apparently. Well now, Jim, I've lived that rough life as you'd be ashamed to hear of. Now for an instant you wouldn't think that I had a pious mother to look at me, would you? Why, no, not in particular, I answered. Ah, well, he said, I did. Remarkable pious. And I was a civil pious boy. And I could rattle off my catechism that fast, as you couldn't tell one word from another. And here's what it's come to, Jim. And it all begun with Chuck Farthing on the blessed gravestone. That's what it begun with. But it went further than that. And so my mother told me and predicted the whole she did, the pious woman. But it were Providence that put me here. I thought it all out here on this lonely island, and I'm back on piety. You don't catch me tasting rum so much, just a thimbleful for luck, of course, the first chance I have. And I'm bound I'll be good, and I'll see the way. And Jim, looking all around and lowering his voice to a whisper, I'm rich. I now felt sure that the poor fellow had gone crazy in his solitude, and I suppose I must have shown the feeling in my face, for he repeated the statement hotly. Rich, I says, and I'll tell you what, I'll make a man of you, Jim. Ah, Jim, you'll bless your stars, you will, that you was the first that found me. And at this there came suddenly a lowering shadow over his face, and he tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threateningly before my eyes. Now, Jim, you tell me true, that ain't Flint's ship, he asked. At this I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I had found an ally, and I answered him at once. It's not Flint's ship. Flint is dead. But I'll tell you true, as you ask me. There are some of Flint's hands aboard. Worse luck for the rest of us. There's not a man with one leg, he gasped. Silver? I asked. Silver, he said. Yes, that were his name. He's the cook, and the ringleader, too. He was still holding me by the wrist, and at that he gave it quite a twist. If you were sent by Long John, he said, I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose? I had made my mind up in a minute. By the way of answer, I told him the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we now found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. You're a good lad, Jim, he said, and you're all on a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Would you think it likely now that your squire could prove a liberal-minded one in the case of help, him being in a clove hitch, as you remark? I told him the squire was the most liberal of men. Aye, but you see, said Ben Gunn, I don't mean giving me a gate to keep and a suit of livery clothes and such. That's not my meaning, Jim. What I mean is, would he be likely to come down to the tune of, say, £1,000 out of the money that's as good as a man owns already? I'm sure he would, said I. As it was, all hands were to share. And a passage home, he added with a look of great shrewdness. Why, I cried, the squire is a gentleman. Besides, if we got rid of the others, we should want you to help work the vessel back home. Ah, he said, so you would. And he seemed very much relieved. Now I'll tell you what, he went on. So much I'll tell you, and no more. I were in Flint's ship when he buried the treasure. He and 6 others, 6 strong seamen. They was ashore nigh a week, and us standing off and on in the old walrus. One fine day up went the signal, and here come Flint by himself in a little boat, and his head done up in a blue scarf. The sun was getting up, and mortal white he looked about the cutwater. But there he was, you mind, and the 6 were all dead and buried. How he done it, not a man aboard could make out. It was battle, murder, and sudden death leastways, him against 6. Billy Bones was the mate, Long John quartermaster, and they asked him where the treasure was. Ah, says he, you can go ashore if you like, and stay, he says. But as for the ship, she'll beat up for more, by thunder. And that's what he said. Well, I was in another ship 3 years back, and we sighted this island. Boys, said I, here's Flint's treasure. Let's land and find it. The captain was displeased at that, but my messmates were all of a mind and landed. 12 days they looked for it, and every day they had the worst word for me until one fine morning all hands went aboard. As for you, Ben Gunn, says they, here's a musket and a spade and a pickaxe. You can stay here and find Flint's money for yourself, they says. Well, Jim, 3 years I've been here. Not a bite of Christian diet from that day to this. But now, look here, look at me. Do I look like a man before the mast? No, says you. Nor I weren't neither, I says. With that he winked and pinched me hard. Just you mention these words to your squire, Jim, he went on. Nor he weren't neither. That's the words. 3 years he was the man of the island, light and dark, fair and rain. Sometimes he would maybe think upon a prayer, says you, and sometimes he would maybe think of his old mother. So be as she's alive, you'll say. But the most part of Gunn's time, this is what you'll say, the most part of his time was took up with another matter. And then you'll give him a nip like I do. And he pinched me again in the most confidential manner. Then, he continued, then you'll up and you'll say this, Gunn is a good man, you'll say, and he puts a precious sight more confidence, a precious sight, mind that, in a gentleman born than in these gentlemen of fortune, having been one himself. Well, I said, I don't understand one word that you've been saying, but that's neither here nor there, for how am I to get on board? Ah, he said, that's the hitch for sure. Well, there's my boat, that I made with my own 2 hands. I keep her under the white rock. If the worst come to the worst, we might try that after dark. Hey, he broke out, what's that? For just then, although the sun still had an hour or 2 to run, all the echoes awoke and bellowed to the thunder of a cannon. They have begun to fight, I cried. Follow me. And I began to run towards the anchorage, my terrors all forgotten, while close at my side the marooned man in his goatskin trotted easily and lightly. Left, left, says he. Keep to your left hand, mate Jim. Under the trees with ye. There's where I killed my first goat. They don't come down here now. They're all on those mountains for the fear of Benjamin Gunn. Ah, and there's the cemetery. Cemetery, he must have meant. You see the mounds? I come here and I prayed now and then, when I thought maybe a Sunday would be about due. It weren't quite a chapel, but it seemed more solemn like, and then, says you, Ben Gunn was short-handed. No chaplain, not so much as a Bible or a flag, you says. So he kept talking as I ran, neither expecting nor receiving any answer. The cannon shot was followed, after a considerable interval, by a volley of small arms. Another pause, and then, not a quarter of a mile in front of me, I beheld the Union Jack flutter in the air above a wood.